study the patterns of the universe.
Advancement in the brain.
Virtual your mind. Talking about your life. Fundamental principles.
Philosophy.
What is and what is not true.
Those who know themselves.
Being better every single day.
Well, hello again, and welcome to another episode of the Think Grow podcast, where personal development meets real life. I'm your host, Ruben Chavez, and I normally explore a variety of topics with thought leaders, creators, scientists, and other interesting people with the goal to bring you different perspectives you can use to enrich your mind and improve your life in whatever way you see fit. Today, I want to talk with you one-on-one about a topic that is near and dear to my heart and I know is really important to a lot of you as well, at least based on many of the messages I've received over the years from you all. And that is the subject of overthinking. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about myself. By nature, I tend to overthink. It's kind of part of my temperament. And I realized this when I was fairly young, and it was a source of frustration for me for a long time until I discovered personal development and learned ways to deal with it effectively. And I became pretty good. So good, actually, that most of my strategies became second nature to me. You know, things like focus on what's important, focus on what I can control, not on what I can't, that sort of thing. These are mental patterns that I kind of execute just unconsciously at this point. But the other day, I had a bout of, well, let's call it acute overthinking that caught me off guard and really blindsided me and led to a variety of negative feelings, mostly anxiety, and kind of paralyzed me from doing anything that day. And this hadn't happened to me in a long time, so I really had to pull out the big guns and employ some of the more powerful strategies that have helped me in the past in order to kind of pull myself out of that hole. So this podcast is partly the post-game analysis of that experience and also partly a guide to just dealing with overthinking in general. It's really as much for you as it is for me because when I am able to think out loud like this, I'm able to clarify certain issues for myself and work out how I think about certain things. So let's start by talking about what overthinking is. Let's define it. I think of overthinking as engaging in repetitive, obsessive thinking that's essentially non-productive. Often it leads to negative emotions like anxiety and insecurity. Turns out fear seems to be the root emotion that underpins all of it. So you might ask, why do we overthink? Where does it come from? That's a very good question, and that's something that I've asked a lot also. Something that I've thought about a lot, ironically enough. As is often the case, I like to look at these kind of modern day problems from an evolutionary perspective. For me, this kind of a framework helps put certain behaviors into context and helps me view certain issues more like technical problems that have practical solutions and explanations, rather than just random problems that don't have any rhyme or reason to them. So let's zoom the lens out a bit and take a moment to first talk about the evolutionary roots of a close cousin of overthinking, whose name is anxiety. It's important to realize that our brains have evolved over literally millions of years to deal with a particular set of circumstances. There's a really good book called Brain Rules, and it's written by this guy named John Medina. He's a developmental molecular biologist and a researcher, and it's all about how to make your brain work better and just improve your cognitive functioning all around. But he says in that book that the brain is designed to do basically four things. And there are, of course, different tasks within these four things, but these are the four overarching categories. And it's basically designed to, 1, solve problems, 2, related to survival, 3, in an unstable outdoor environment, and 4, to do so in nearly constant motion. So those are just good reference points to have for what I'm about to say. Now, the first humans evolved roughly 2 million years ago. But for the vast majority of the time that we've been roaming the earth, we've had to deal with very different kind of problems than the ones we deal with today, like fundamentally different kinds of problems. Specifically, we've had to deal with immediate physical danger and survival-related stress, like being chased by an animal kind of danger. And it's hard for most of us to imagine that harsh of an environment. And in this kind of an environment, it served our ancestors very well to constantly be on the lookout for any threats to their survival. In other words, to be a little anxious. And those that were anxious, passed their genes on to us. Lucky us. But this means that anxiety isn't a flaw in our cognitive circuitry, it's a feature of it, which is a mind-blowing fact to me. And actually, I talk with cognitive scientist Don Hoffman about this in an episode that we did a couple weeks ago on this podcast. I think it's episode number 4. It's called Rethinking Reality, and he has some great insights on this concept. But anyway, back to the matter at hand. Most of us don't have these same kind of threats today, these same kind of survival-based threats. Obviously, there are still people, unfortunately, who live in war-torn countries and still struggle for survival in different ways. But by and large, we've gained control over our environment, and most of us live relatively comfortable lives, especially compared to our ancestors and especially from a survival standpoint. But here's the problem. This shift to modernity happened extremely quickly, like basically overnight in evolutionary terms. And why this happened is a whole other topic that I plan on exploring in another episode and hopefully talk with an expert about, because it's super interesting. But anyway, the point is that because this sudden change to our environment happened so quickly, our brains haven't had time to catch up and adapt accordingly. And it turns out that this is actually the cause of a whole bunch of modern day problems, anxiety being one of them. See, our brains are still running that same survival software that helped keep it alive for millions of years. And so it continues to look for problems even when there are none. Just realizing this fact should release you from some of the guilt associated with anxiety and overthinking. It did for me when I learned it, and I just kind of realized I'm not weird. I'm just well adapted for survival. And that's a really useful way to reframe it, at least it has been for me. And obviously there are ways to deal with anxiety directly, things like meditation, mindfulness, therapy. And I'm not talking about anxiety in the clinical sense, I'm talking about more day-to-day anxiety. There are tools to deal with it. I think that overcoming overthinking is a way to kind of indirectly deal with anxiety, because I find that overthinking often leads to anxiety. And in general, I really believe that an important part of effectively dealing with many of our modern day issues is taking an honest look at our biology and our hardwiring, etc., and then coming up with viable solutions based on that, ones that take into account our human nature. That way we're less at the mercy of our biology and more in control of it. And this is one of the reasons why I love reading books like Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. Sapiens is one of the most fascinating and thought-provoking books ever. It's basically a brief history of humankind, as its subtitle says, but it's the way Yuval writes is just so clear and educational and impactful. It's a very interesting read. And just as a side note, Sapiens is awesome as an audiobook. That's actually how I initially consumed it, and I've listened to it twice since then. And if you want to check it out, you can get it from Audible. That's where I listen to all my audiobooks. And they've actually been kind enough to offer a free trial and a free audiobook for listeners of this podcast. So you can go to audibletrial.com/TGP. And that's for a free 1-month trial of the service plus a free audiobook of your choice when you sign up. So I'll put that link in the show notes for this episode, which you can find on my website or in your podcast app. But anyway, back to overthinking. So you might be asking, how does anxiety tie in with overthinking exactly? Well, if anxiety is the mechanism that our brain uses to stay alert for any threats in our environment, I would argue that overthinking is the result of that mechanism short-circuiting. As far as I can tell, overthinking is largely a modern problem. It's often the result of being too comfortable or having too many options. In other words, not having any real survival-based problems. What happens is, in the absence of any immediate and concrete threats to our existence, our brain basically defaults to overthinking. It mistakes vague worries about the future with survival-based problems that it's wired to deal with quickly and effectively. And see, the solutions to complex modern-day problems are fundamentally different than the solutions to immediate danger. For example, take a modern day problem like choosing your career path and then put that up against an immediate danger like a saber-toothed tiger just jumped out of a bush nearby. Well, see, how you navigate your career has a lot of moving parts to it. It doesn't necessarily have one clear-cut solution. But on the other hand, dealing with a saber-toothed tiger basically has two options: fight or flight. No time to overthink. There's nothing to overthink about. It's just a problem to solve right there. And it just turns out that our brains are better equipped to deal with this kind of survival-based problem. But when it's presented with a complex modern-day problem that has a lot of moving parts to it, it gets kind of short-circuited and goes into overthinking mode, especially if we're not aware of what's happening. And like I said, today most of us aren't facing these immediate threats to our life. We're facing vague anxieties about our relationships, our jobs, our future. And these problems, these modern day problems, need to be dealt with in a much different and more deliberate way. So what is that way? What's the solution? Okay, well, I don't think there's a magic pill, but there are strategies that I found useful for dealing with overthinking, and I'll share some of them with you here. The ones that will work for you really come down to your temperament, they come down to your personal preference and what you gravitate toward and what you feel is going to work for you. Now, before I get into the first strategy, I want to put forth an idea that I've thought about carefully, and it may seem crazy to you at first, but I would argue that the term overthinking is actually kind of a misnomer, and what we call overthinking is usually underthinking. And what I mean by that is that if you find yourself engaging in repetitive, obsessive, non-productive thinking, it's likely that you're not 100% clear on what's bothering you exactly. You probably haven't given enough thought to why you're feeling the way you're feeling, and you probably have a handful of unthought thoughts and maybe even unfelt emotions that need to be unpacked. It's kind of like you have this problem that you haven't fully solved or thought all the way through, and it's just kind of looming over your head. But what's great about these strategies that I'm about to share with you is that even if you can't solve the problem practically, you can come to terms with it emotionally and psychologically. And this is actually extremely useful, more useful than it might sound to you. So I have a couple of strategies to share with you. And the first one is get clarity on what's bothering you. Okay, so let me explain this. As I've said already, our 2 million-year-old brains are wired to deal with immediate threats to our survival. They're not really wired to deal with vague anxieties about the future. We used to be very clear about what we were afraid of. Today, we're often not even sure what we're so worried about. So in order to maintain our mental health, we really need to deconstruct our thoughts and get super clear on what's bothering us. We can't rely on that old survival software in our brains to figure out how to navigate our modern world. We have to be more deliberate about it. So the first thing you have to do is identify exactly what you're overthinking about. Once you've pinpointed it, then you have to deconstruct it into its component parts. So when I'm overthinking, I found that it's usually not just one single issue that's bothering me. It's really a combination of several issues interacting with each other. So for example, in my case that I alluded to earlier at the beginning of this episode, what happened was I was trying to come up with an episode idea for this podcast, and everything I thought of I would dismiss almost immediately as not good enough or stupid or whatever. And even ideas that I thought were really good when I wrote them down now seemed unoriginal and trite and all the other negative adjectives you could think of. And I went through literally hundreds of notes and several notebooks of mine, and I came up with a whole bunch of reasons why each one was not good enough. And at first I got really frustrated. And then that frustration eventually turned into anxiety because I realized that I had just wasted the past 6 or 7 hours talking myself out of every good idea I had. So after wallowing in self-pity for a while, I decided to get clear on what exactly was bothering me and deconstruct my negative thoughts and emotions, break them down into their respective parts. So I started by asking myself, a very important question. I asked myself what I was afraid of. And it turned out that two of the main fears I had when I started writing down my response to this question were that, one, I would inadvertently talk about something irrelevant or meaningless to people, and two, is that I would be unoriginal or repetitive and therefore let my audience down. Okay, so those were important beliefs to uncover. But after thinking about these beliefs a little more, I realized that I wasn't being super logical in my thinking. So for example, to my first point, my first negative belief, which was that I would inadvertently talk about something irrelevant or meaningless, well, I realized that as long as I do my best to create something that I find interesting or useful, that's really all I can do. And in fact, this has been the recipe for a lot of my success. And then to my second point of being repetitive or unoriginal and letting my audience down, well, I realized that after thinking about it, even if I were to create something quote unquote repetitive, what would be so bad about that? Personally, I love hearing concepts more than once. I listen to podcasts several times often, and I read books more than once. What would be so bad about hearing something useful more than once? And I came to the conclusion that I'm sure my audience wouldn't mind either. And as far as the unoriginal thing, I realized that as long as I stay true to my own perspective and my own experience, by definition, it won't be unoriginal. It can't be. And I know these sound like simple and almost obvious conclusions to come to, but the point is that I wouldn't have thought of them, at least not consciously, unless I made a deliberate effort to sort out my thoughts and really get clear about what was bothering me. So yeah, these are just a couple of the thoughts among several others that I was able to sort out with this exercise. It's not a magic pill, but it will very likely, I think, help get some positive momentum going for a lot of you that are stuck in overthinking ruts. But basically, the main idea is just write down everything you're anxious about and then put each item under a microscope to see if it holds any weight. And this is also a great way to practice becoming the observer of your thoughts rather than the participant and increase awareness of those unconscious thoughts that are at the root of most cases of overthinking. And this is something that Eckhart Tolle talks a lot about in his book, The Power of Now, as an antidote to repetitive negative thoughts. And actually, I've found that sometimes simply clarifying the issue like this is enough to ease your anxiety because you're no longer dealing with a vague worry, but rather you're dealing with a concrete problem that you can act upon. And like I said, our brains are optimized to deal with concrete problems. They're not optimized to deal with abstract ones, so make your problems concrete. All right, so here are some other questions you can ask yourself to help deconstruct your anxiety and overthinking. So one question that I already went over is, what am I afraid of? And like I've said, the emotions at the root of overthinking are often fear-based, such as anxiety or insecurity. So this question gets to the heart of the matter. Another great question is, why is this causing me to feel anxious or worried or afraid or whatever? Write your answer to that down. Clarify it. Another great question is, what can I do about it? If you can do something about it, if you can do something about the thing that's bothering you or the problem that you have, then now you have a concrete problem that you can act upon. But if you can't do anything about it, if it's outside of your control, then why worry? It's simple logic. So another really good question is, will this matter 2 weeks from now? I've found that sometimes just applying a different time frame to my perceived problem is enough to kind of get me out of this overthinking rut because it helps put things into perspective. Okay, so let's say that you're worried about some future thing that may or may not happen. The best strategy to deal with that, I think, is to think of the worst possible outcome you can think of relating to this thing, the worst case scenario, and ask yourself, how would I deal with this if it did happen? You'll often be able to come up with ways to deal with it that are actionable and practical, and this in and of itself will relieve a lot of your anxiety and need to overthink. This is an extremely empowering exercise. And even if there's no practical solution, you can at least mentally come to terms with it happening. This in and of itself gives you power and a feeling of control, which are extremely important contributing factors to feeling happy and at peace. And this is actually part of the ancient Stoic practice of negative visualization, which is in fact a precursor to modern day cognitive behavioral therapy. And that brings me to my second big strategy for dealing with overthinking, and that is be aware of cognitive distortions. Okay, so let me explain this. After deconstructing your repetitive thoughts and after you write all those things down and unpack all your emotions, etc., you'll probably uncover some pretty negative beliefs you have about yourself or about the world or about your situation. These beliefs, however, are often cognitive distortions. What are cognitive distortions? Well, they're essentially irrational ways of thinking that masquerade as logical but are actually distortions of reality. And these are formally recognized phenomena in psychology, and they're something to be aware of. But part of the reason that cognitive distortions happen is because when we're in a state of anxiety or depression or negative thinking, our ability to reason decreases significantly. And there have actually been studies that have shown this to be true. So here are a few common cognitive distortions that you should be aware of. The first common one is called fortune teller error. Fortune teller error is basically predicting a negative outcome without realistically considering the actual odds of that outcome. So, for example, if you say something like, well, if I go to the party tonight, I know that nobody's going to want to talk with me, or something like that. It's like you're basically predicting the future or pretending to predict the future, but you have no real basis for that. So another cognitive distortion that I'll share with you is called all or nothing thinking. And all or nothing thinking is essentially just thinking in extremes. Either you're a total failure or a total success. And if we're really honest with ourselves, we have to conclude that this isn't really how life works. There's a lot of gray area. Life is not black and white. But all or nothing thinking makes you believe that it is. Okay, so the third and final cognitive distortion that I'll share with you here is called overgeneralizing. Overgeneralizing is just taking one example of something and applying it to all cases. So for instance, you didn't stick with your diet last week, so that probably means you're just not capable of making any lifestyle change ever. Well, what you just did there was extrapolate the results from one instance in your life to all instances, past, present, and future. But the reality is one does not necessarily follow the other. So anyway, for a full list of all the different cognitive distortions that lead to this kind of maladaptive thinking, I really recommend the book Feeling Good. It's by David Burns, and it's all about cognitive behavioral therapy. It's very comprehensive, but there's a whole section where he explains in detail all these cognitive distortions. There are like a dozen of them, and then he expands on them, gives examples of how to combat them, and it's very helpful. And again, a great audiobook too. Very practical, very helpful. So basically, the main idea here is just run your negative beliefs through some of these filters, and you'll start to gain some clarity on your situation and see where you might not be thinking clearly. Again, these are not quick fixes or magic pills, but I think these strategies are excellent starting points when dealing with overthinking and, to some extent, anxiety. I want to mention some other strategies really quickly here that really deserve their own episodes, but I didn't want to end this episode without at least mentioning them. One of those is exercise vigorously. Exercise can be a really simple and effective way to stop overthinking. And the reason why that is because you're getting out of your head completely and into your body. It's very difficult to have repetitive obsessive thoughts when you're, gasping for breath. So go take a swim, go take a run, get out in nature, go hiking, get into the gym. These kinds of things can really make a difference. I've noticed actually that if I'm having a day where I'm in my head a lot and maybe overthinking more than normal, it's usually because I haven't exercised in a while. The other strategy I'll mention is to talk with someone that you trust about your worries and your repetitive thoughts to fully unpack them. And this is basically a corollary to what I've already talked about here, and that's writing down your thoughts. And if you are a person who really likes to talk with other people and does better verbally, then this might be a better option for you. Maybe writing your thoughts down is the way you start, but then you take it to someone that you trust, a family member, a friend, your significant other, and talk with them about what you're worried about, what you're anxious about, what you're overthinking about. Often, getting that out in the open and saying it out loud can make us realize that, we're not thinking rationally about this. Or the feedback from that person that you're talking to can often help to clarify issues for us and put us at ease. So that is another strategy that is really effective. And that's pretty much all I have for you. I hope you found this episode helpful. If you did, I humbly ask you to please subscribe and or leave me a review on iTunes, or you can just share this episode or this podcast with a friend who you think might find value in it. That would be an excellent way to support this podcast as well. And if you've already done any of these, I want to take a moment to sincerely thank you. Thank you so much. I truly, truly appreciate your support. And lastly, I just want to remind you that you can find the links to all the books that I mentioned in this episode in the show notes on my website, thinkgrowprosper.org, or in your podcast app. This is also where you're going to find the link to get a free 1-month trial and audiobook from Audible. And that link again is audibletrial.com/TGP.